The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
Thank you very much. Vabakshni, it is now 5.5 minutes after 8. We welcome you to the Forum at 8 here on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. Well, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad yesterday launching a fresh tirade then against the West, saying that the Islamic Republic does not fear military action. The West has imposed tough sanctions to try to force Iran to open up its nuclear activities to international scrutiny amid suspicions that it is secretly trying to develop nuclear weapons. With little diplomatic progress despite numerous rounds of talks, Washington then has refused to rule out military action, and senior Israeli politicians have spoken of the possibility of airstrikes. On the forum this morning, then, we asked this question: will military action against Iran's nuclear program succeed in stopping that country's nuclear ambition, or will it simply serve to strengthen its resolve in this regard? What are your thoughts then? I'll take your SMSs at 34701 on this matter, 34701. But also you can send us an email at gwalax@sabc.co.za, gwalax@sabc.co.za. A little later on, I'll be taking your calls. Remember this number. It is 0891 104 208. Remember it again. It is 0891 104 208. You can also visit us on our Facebook page here on SAFM. It is AM Live on SAFM. Let me welcome my guest then to discuss this question with me this morning. Here in studio, I'm joined by Professor Farid Isaac. He's the head of the Department of Religious Studies at UJ. A very good morning to you, Professor. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. Of course, UJ meaning the University of Johannesburg. On the line then from Jerusalem, we're joined by Professor Gerald Steinberg. He's the president of the NGO Monitor. Professor Steinberg, good to have you on the program. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much.
Thanks indeed for your time. I'm also joined by Tom Wheeler. Tom Wheeler is with the South African Institute of International Affairs. Tom, as always, good to have you.
Thank you, Zani.
Thank you very much. Let me start in Jerusalem there with Professor Steinberg. Professor Steinberg, of course, last week then there was a meeting between U.S. President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I just want to start off by asking you of the probability of an attack after that meeting. Do you think that the probability has increased or decreased?
I think it stayed roughly the same. Perhaps it's been delayed. The decision has been delayed for a while. The question which both President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu dealt with was how close is the Iranian regime to completing its illicit, illegal nuclear weapons program? When is the point of no return? And now it looks like the two leaders agreed that there was still some more time, that the sanctions that have been used to try to get the Iranian government and the Iranian population to realize how dangerous, how illegal, how immoral it is for them to continue to pursue what everybody now agrees is an illegal nuclear weapons program. They've hidden it for many years. We still have some more months, perhaps 6 months, perhaps a little bit more, a little bit less, to see whether this government in Iran will understand that what they're doing needs to stop, or, as both leaders said, and many others, including in Europe and elsewhere, have said, there will be nothing left to do other than to use military action, because an Iran with nuclear weapons, an Iran that supports terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, that blows up embassies in Buenos Aires and Jewish community centers, an Iran like that is extremely dangerous, not only for Israel, but for the rest of the world.
All right. What we'll try and do, though, Professor, is that we'll call you back because the line is just slightly giving us a bit of a problem. But we get your point about this. Let me come back to the professor here with me in the studio. The probability of an attack?
Well, I certainly think that I agree with Professor Wheeler that the recent discussions between Netanyahu and Obama has neither accelerated the possibilities of an attack nor delayed it. I do, however, think that it is quite probable and that unlike the Israeli gestures, that this may well happen before the United States elections. I think that the political spin-offs for it after the elections may be much worse for Israel. And I think that the Obama regime would be caught in some kind of necessity before the elections to, given the very right-wing nature of the electorate in the United States, to come across as supportive of Israel in event of such an attack on Iran.
So if it happens before the elections in November in the United States, is it safe to assume that Israel will go it alone?
I think in both cases it is safe to assume that Israel will go it alone. I think both before the elections and after the elections, there is no particular reason to imagine why the United States would join Israel in such an attack. Although soon, immediately after it happened, one can well imagine the United States flying to the defense of Israel as it invariably and inevitably does.
Professor Steinberg, hopefully on a better line to you now. The timing, again, you say that the probability has neither increased or decreased, but a while ago, the Defense Minister of the United States, Defense Secretary Panetta, was talking to a Washington Post reporter, and he said he thinks that the attack may happen between now and April or latest June. What do you think about those timeframes?
Well, there's a lot of speculation, and that was one of the points that was raised. I think part of the process is to get the Iranian leadership, which is very, very mysterious in terms of how they operate and how they calculate when they're putting out these kinds of threats, to pay attention. So perhaps the Secretary of Defense Panetta was simply trying to get their attention, to get them to realize that this is very, very serious, and they cannot continue to go on and defy international opinion and international law by pursuing nuclear weapons. I think now what we've had is an agreement. It's not necessarily the case. A lot of what we're doing now is speculating, all of us, but it seems to be that there is an agreement on both the American, Israeli, and also European sides to wait a few more months, as long as Iran does not cross more nuclear thresholds, so that I would not expect nuclear action, at least until the fall, a military action. But I think the real issue here is to focus on what Iran is doing, why it is doing it, and what can be done to prevent Iran. Because if Iran gets nuclear weapons, then every country in the region will be very, very nervous. They'll certainly the United Arab Emirates, the Kuwait, all the small countries in the region that Iran will then come to dominate. Also the Sunni governments, we can expect them. The Saudis will certainly seek nuclear weapons. Despite everything that's going on, Iran would not allow, Egypt would not allow Iran simply to have nuclear weapons. So the region will become extremely, extremely unstable. And that's another major concern of the United States. This is not about Israel. This is about Iran being a source of extreme, extreme violence and instability in the region.
But if it is not about Israel, then why is Israel instigating at the forefront of an attack?
I don't think that the word instigating is appropriate. Israel has reasonable concerns because Israel has been singled out. If one listens to the very blood-curdling statements that we hear from Ahmadinejad and from other Iranian leaders talking about destroying Israel with a single nuclear weapon, they are using what's called the Israel card. They're using among Muslims and among Arabs this radical, fanatical hatred of the Jewish people in Israel, and that is a source of concern. And there are countries in the region who understand that that is something that should not be allowed. So Israel has extra concern, but it's certainly not the only target and the only victim of this type of Iranian actions.
And I'm going to come back to Tom Wheeler in a second. But again, Professor Steinberg, the question that other people are asking elsewhere in the world is that why should Israel tell us who can and who cannot have the nuclear weapons when it has nuclear weapons?
Israel's not telling anybody anything. Israel, first of all, has never signed any agreement, not violating an agreement. Iran is. Iran is violating a very solemn agreement. It's been so determined by the United Nations Security Council, by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They said they would not use the equipment, the assistance, the educational tools that they're getting in the realm of peaceful nuclear development and technology to develop weapons. They lied. They lied continuously for the last at least 20, 25 years, and that is something that very few countries have done. The other exceptions are North Korea, Syria, Libya under Gaddafi. Those countries were all caught at the...
Sure. But Professor, sorry to interrupt you, because then are you suggesting, and this is the other possibility that people have put forward, if Iran, for instance, were just to say, well, we then are getting out of the NPT, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, will that then justify them acquiring nuclear weapons? Because if you say that Israel is not a member, therefore then it can have nuclear weapons.
International treaties are not something that one can simply adopt one day and then reject the next day. It doesn't work that way. If you accept the treaty and the terms and all the benefits and you say, yes, please give me this technology, send me reactors, send me scientists, send me uranium, help me with this, as the Iranians did for many years, if they allow inspectors in order to show that they're in fact not violating the treaty, but they cheat and they hide and they don't let inspectors to see certain facilities, and then they start to cover up, which is what we saw last week, trying to completely remove any apparently nuclear traces from a site that was determined by satellite inspection. That's cheating. That's an entirely different realm. If a country says, look, these terms, as in the case of India, for instance, the terms are not suitable for our security situation, please, we're not asking for the benefits, but we're also not going to violate the rules. One can discuss that. one certainly has to agree that the Israeli security situation is unique anywhere in the world. A very, very tiny country, and I think people in South Africa don't realize how tiny Israel actually is. Always been threatened since 1948. Today, Israeli towns and cities are being bombarded by rockets that are being fired from Gaza, some of which are provided by Iran.
All right, let's bring in Tom Wheeler in this discussion. Tom, then do you think that if Israel or the United States or anyone else, in fact, were to go then and attack Iran, what would that achieve?
I think it would just create greater instability in the region. Unfortunately, the Iranians, like the professor said, play this double game of claiming to be, using, entitled to the peaceful uses of atomic energy through their membership of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But whenever the inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency go there to check things, they initially say, yes, you can see things, and then at the last minute pull back. Now, there seemed to be a hopeful sign a week or so ago when they agreed to allow the inspectors to see a military site which is suspected of being the heart of the program. Now, whether that is going to take place or not, I don't know. But unfortunately, because they seem to be unreliable, they're members of the treaty, and they claim the benefits of it, and yet they don't want to admit the inspectors to prove what they're saying. It destabilizes the situation and leads to these issues that have been explained by the two previous speakers. And now I always say that Iran, now and let me just say this also, that Iran has a great tussle going on internally at the moment. They've just had an election, and the president, Ahmadinejad, has suffered badly and has not, come out of this well. So he is in a strange conflictual situation with the supreme leader, the religious leader, who is really the power in Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And so, there's an internal battle going on, and I think some of that internal battle is being reflected by this nuclear policy of theirs, because I believe Iranian people in general are very strongly nationalistic and feel that they are entitled to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Sure. But then it sort of swings over to the other side every now and again, and that is the cause for concern for everybody.
Let me bring in Professor Isaac then. Your thoughts on the effects of a likely attack?
Well, the effects of a likely attack is going to be devastating. First of all, the assumption that Iran is prepared to target Israel. Iran is not as stupid as to imagine that here is this country called Israel, a homogeneous bloc, that there are no Muslims living in there, and that Israelis live in completely separate enclaves, and that you can actually nuclear bomb a place without affecting your own co-religionists and people that have been supporting you passionately. And so the whole idea, of an Iranian attack, an Iranian nuclear attack on Israel, that is an idea that has been vastly blown out of proportion. I think it is being propagandized. It is warmongers that's going on and on about this. Very particular reasons for the reduction of the entire Middle Eastern problems to Iran, and very, very cleverly our correspondent from Jerusalem completely ignores the fact that stability in the region assumes as if there is stability in the region, and Iranian and a nuclear armed Iran will introduce instability in the region. Instability in the region comes from the fact of occupation. Instability in the region comes from the practice of apartheid that the Palestinians are subjected to. This is very similar to the story in South Africa, where the government was all about law. Was about law and order. Law and order.
The point, though, you're making, Professor, is that are you suggesting that Israeli fears of a nuclear-armed Iran are not justified?
I think it is completely unjustified. I think that it is being manipulated at the moment. The problem is that Iran represents the only credible ideological argument and threat to overwhelming United States interest by the other Arab countries in the world. And now, in the name of defending the other Arab countries, Iran has to be attacked. Iran has to be
but let's look at some of the facts raised by Professor Steinberg, for instance, that if Iran were to then possess the nuclear weapons, that will spark an arms race in the region, because countries such as Saudi Arabia will probably want to have them as well.
Well, it is
countries
the Israeli
such as
bomb.
Turkey.
It is the Israeli bomb that may be spurring the Iranian input. If the Iranians, there is a bomb at the moment. There is a bomb at the moment that exists outside the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, 200 nuclear bombs.
Yeah, but
Israel has never denied that it has this.
Fine. We'll come back to the Israeli issue, but the issue is that if Iran were to possess one, that would spark an arms race in the region. That's one element of it. But Israel is also concerned about what then happens to the so-called proxies of Iran in Lebanon, in the form of Hezbollah, and also what happens to the proxies of Iran in Gaza in the form of Hamas.
So, I'm sorry, I'm really informed by my South African history. So what happens to the proxies of Moscow in South Africa? The proxies of Moscow, the South African Communist Party, the ANC, these were all the proxies of Moscow that the United States and the other Western countries kept on throwing at us. And we knew, despite the fact that these entities received moral and financial support from outside, that the heart of the support for all of those entities were inside the country. And so Hamas and Hezbollah, these are Lebanese entities, these are Palestinian entities, regardless of where they're getting their support from, and their very existence emanates from the conditions on the ground. So
finally, before I go to the professor, before the professor again responds, Ahmadinejad and the Iranians have said over and over again that they would like to wipe Israel off the map.
Ahmadinejad's quote, in a very direct way, translated directly from Farsi, had nothing to do with eliminating Israel from the map. Ahmadinejad spoke about the occupying regime vanishing from the pages of time. All regimes will vanish from the pages of time. Continents vanish from the pages of time. I and you vanish from the pages of time. Apartheid South Africa vanished from the pages of time. Why should
But he has said over and again that the Zionist regime is the problem in the region, i.e. then clearly would want to do something about it.
Well, there are many Israelis who are arguing for a one-state solution. There are many liberals and Democrats who are saying that any state founded for any particular ethnic or religious group has no place in our world today. So Ahmadinejad is not alone in calling for the end of an ethnic state.
Professor Steinberg, your responses, please.
It's hard to respond to a very emotional, one-sided, and unfortunately misinformed presentation. Trying to compare the situation in the Middle East. Now look what we see every day in the headlines. We see Assad. We didn't hear a word about the dictatorship of Assad and the slaughter that he's imposing on his people. And in fact, human rights organizations have ignored the dictatorship, the totalitarian regime, the anti-human rights policies and activities of these kinds of regimes, of Gaddafi and of Assad, and throughout the Middle East. What we have is an obsession against Israel.
Wait, but Professor, explain something to me. How do you link Assad?
Not just wrong, but it's immoral.
Professor, please connect the dots for me. How do you link Assad with the threat to attack Iran?
Assad is the Syrians under the Assad regime were really the only non-Shiite entity, the only state in the region that supported the radical Islamic regime in Iran. When they were fighting the Iran-Iraq war, it was Syria under the Assad family that provided the first missiles. And then, of course, afterwards, the Iranian regime was able to get more missiles from North Korea and basically copy what's called reverse engineering, the missile fabrication process, and so Iran then developed its long-range missiles. Their allies are in Syria. If, in fact, the Assad regime goes, it's going to be Syria that's going to suffer. It's Iran. It's Iran that's going to suffer. It's Iran. It's the regime. It's the supreme leader and his forces, whoever mysteriously they may be. It's Ahmadinejad and that regime that's now in Syria trying to prop up this regime that's slaughtering its own people.
But how does that threaten? But how does that threaten Israel? But how does that threaten Israel? Please link that to Israel's existential threat as is put forward by the defense minister.
If Iran becomes the dominant power in the region, if Iran has nuclear weapons and then provides an umbrella to major terrorist organization. Hezbollah almost controls Lebanon now. It's part of the government. It's an army within a state, but in fact now it's terrorized the Lebanese people into accepting them as part of the structure. So you have Iran with Hezbollah and with Syria. If Iran then has nuclear weapons, extends its power and its influence elsewhere, it's a threat to everybody in the region. Iran has regional dominance. That's its goal. It's very clear. And let's not forget the Sunni-Shia conflict that's been going on for hundreds of years, but certainly we see it now very strongly. All of that is regional instability. So it's not just a threat to Israel, and that's the point I keep trying to make. Yes, Israel is targeted very much through terrorism, through rhetoric, through threats of destruction, and the Jewish people, unfortunately, have a history where they need to take those threats seriously. But it's not simply about Israel. And this obsession that we hear from my colleague on the other end of the phone, constantly talking about Israel and comparing it to apartheid South Africa, is frankly, it's an emotional.
But Professor, let me come back. Let me come back to the issue here, because if the consideration of whether somebody or whether a country can or cannot have nuclear weapons is stability versus instability in that country, people are saying Israel has actually never known peace since 1948 and therefore is unstable. They shouldn't have nuclear weapons. They can't then pontificate and call other people unstable.
Israel is the only country in the region, first of all, the only democracy, second of all, the only country in the region that, in fact, has had a stable government. You don't see an Israeli government killing thousands of people.
But it's never been.
Syria.
But there's never been
Gaddafi
peace
in Libya. The comparison just is completely inappropriate.
Wait,
Israel is a source of stability in the region, and if the radical regimes, first we had in 1948, we had dictators like Nasser in the early 50s who said, let's wipe Israel off the map. They're using the Israeli issue. They're using what is really a racist card or an anti-religious card in order to enhance their popularity and their power in the region, appealing to the lowest level of the masses in trying to gain that kind of support. And now we have the radical regime in Iran doing the same thing. Why are they so much focused on Israel? They don't share a border with Israel. They don't have a history with Israel. They're using it for very cynical, manipulative, political reasons.
I'm going to take calls. I'm going to take calls, Professor, but I want to ask you this, because you've been talking about this non-proliferation treaty, and others are saying actually what will happen is if you attack, or if Israel attacks Iran, Iran then will leave the NPT, taking its program underground, focusing on making a bomb and making the bomb pretty quickly.
But we heard that also in the case of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And in fact, so many different things happened that I think one has to be very careful about predicting the future. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. There are many, many possible scenarios. But a treaty, and perhaps the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is the most important international treaty. It has, in fact, provided a degree of stability. Instead of having dozens of countries with nuclear weapons, we've had very few. Israel has not tested, has not declared it has nuclear weapons. It has been very careful in its policies to provide necessary deterrence, but not to wave this in the face of anybody else, unlike the situation, for instance, in North Korea or India and Pakistan, or as we're seeing now in Iran. So the treaty has extreme value, and to destroy that treaty by blatantly ignoring its provisions makes the treaty worthless. That's what's destroying the treaty, and in fact, that's what the heads of the International Atomic Energy Agency have been saying, and that's why they're so insistent that Iran open up its program.
All right.
You cannot have a treaty that one country continues to ignore.
Let me quickly get a comment from Tom Wheeler, and then I'll take the news headlines. Lots of calls. Philip Msing, Joy in Cape Town, Janos in Cape Town, Chris Landsberg also on the line. I'll hear from them in a second. But Tom Wheeler, your comment then, having heard what the two the previous speakers have said.
Yeah, I think that the question of Iran being, on the other side of the Gulf and a different part of Islam, the Shia versus the Sunnis on the south, is a very important dividing line, and therefore a cause of fear for the other states in that region. Now, as the professor said, Israel is a tiny country. You cannot bomb Israel and not affect all the neighboring countries as well. So I think it's a highly dangerous situation that will take great wisdom on the part of all to deal with. I have great fear that if any one party makes a move, that it will set off a conflagration of absolutely catastrophic proportions.
All right, let me ask all my guests then to please just stand by for me. I need to take the news headlines, also just talk to Sigi, find out what's on Morning Talk today, and then continue taking calls on 0891 104 208 and emails at gwalax@sabc.co.za. First up, though, remember that here on the forum we are asking this question: will military action against Iran's nuclear program succeed in stopping that country's nuclear ambitions, or will it simply serve to strengthen its resolve? One or two SMSs, and then I'll go to the lines. There is Temba in Joburg who says, state-sponsored Christian and Jewish terrorism perpetrated by America and Israel are the biggest threats to the world peace today. Sam in Johannesburg also says, Iran promised to wipe out Israel off the map. KH Nkwe in Rustenburg says, Christians must know their fate is one with Israel. Religious wars looming, viva Israel. Another one says, Iran is a peaceful democratic country and threatens no other country. Israel is a nuclear-armed aggressor and must be kept in check. Let me take Chris Landsberg in Johannesburg. Good to have you on the radio this morning. Chris, thank you for your call.
Yes, thank you. Let me just take issue with our two professors, and I'm not talking about Professor Esak here. I'm talking about particularly the professor, sorry, I didn't get the name,
Steinberg.
The one who said Professor Esak was engaging in a lot of emotional anti-Israeli claptrap. I mean, he was so emotional in his defense of Israel, it makes nonsense of his comment. Let me just put out two realities out there, Kolani. No other country in the world except Iran is surrounded by 6 nuclear states. I repeat, no other country. China, Russia, Egypt, then you have Pakistan and India with the full assistance of America. Pakistan is infinitely more unstable than Iran is at present. They kept reminding us that this is about preventing Iran from becoming a dominant state. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty says that while only 5 countries in the world should possess nuclear weapons, everybody else should not acquire them. They can't bring themselves to admit the fact that Israel does have nuclear weapons. Why can't they? And may I remind, just finally, the professor who invoked Iraq, that remember the famous, or shall I say, infamous pictures of Colin Powell a couple of years ago going to the United Nations Security Council trying to make the case for weapons in Iraq. We're still waiting for those weapons today. The real sad thing about Iran, finally, is that not only are they trying to prevent this country from acquiring nuclear weapons, they're even trying to prevent this country, which is a right acquired by the NPT, they're trying to prevent this country from even a nuclear civilian program. This is the problem that we're sitting with. It is about the dominance of America in that part of the world, and Iran is the next victim.
All right, Chris, I thank you very much. Chris Landsberg here in Johannesburg. Let me see if Professor Steinberg is still there, because I would like him to specifically respond to what Chris Landsberg called about in some of the SMSs. Professor Steinberg.
Yes, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Go ahead, please.
Well, I think what we heard was a mix, an emotional mix that somehow turned Iran from being a major aggressor state into a country which is threatened. If one looks at the size of Iran, if one looks at the history of Iran, if we look at the neighborhood, including the claim, there was a claim that Egypt has nuclear weapons, which of course is not the case. One can always construct an artificial excuse. But and I think the biggest problem is, I think the main point that was emphasized, Pakistan does have nuclear weapons, and Pakistan is extremely dangerous in the instability that it's going through, in the way that some of the groups in Pakistan see the world around them and could conceivably threaten other countries and other regions in the world. So do we want to have another Pakistan, another country which is very much distorted by internal conflict and very much in a conflict with its neighbors, including the use of terrorism and supporting various proxy and terrorist
groups? But Professor, my caller is making a point about how then threatened Iran may very well be, given the fact that it's got 6 countries around it. 5, again, I beg your pardon, 5 countries. Anyway. I beg your pardon?
He included Egypt in that, which of course is not part of the
All right,
issue.
but 5 of them are correct.
China and Iran are close trading partners. The idea that China or India or even Pakistan threaten Iran in any way is ludicrous. It's an artificial argument. It doesn't make any sense. It avoids the historical and the daily facts that we see every day. It's Iran that's exporting missiles and weapons to Hezbollah that are being used to attack various other countries and other people. It's Iran that is supporting international terrorism. It's Iran that tried to kill Israeli diplomats in New Delhi and in Bangkok just a few days ago. All of these things are not invented. These are something we can see on the news every day. We need to get away from the invented history and ideological history and emotional history and look at the details of what's actually happening on the ground.
Well, I mean, if any of these crimes can be laid at the feet of Iran, I mean, exactly the same litany of crimes and so on can be laid at Israel. But of course, if we do this, then we will be accused of being emotional and so on. Just two things, really. This whole colonial idea that only white folks can have weapons and blacks are not allowed to have weapons. This is a replication of that only white people can have guns, blacks are by nature barbarian, blacks are out to threaten us.
But is that what it is?
This is exactly what is at the heart of this.
I don't know that
here you have a country. China has not opposed the Iranian. China has not opposed the Iranian attempt to develop nuclear power. China has not oppose the Iranian attempts to acquire nuclear power.
Against Iran in the United Nations and
the second thing is this. So on the one hand, then we are now being told that Pakistan does not threaten Iran. On the one hand, we find that it's a Sunni Shia thing, but now Pakistan, a major Sunni country, all of a sudden the Sunni dynamics against the Shia. Against the Iranian dynamics, that is of no consequence. We are reducing deep imperialist interest into that country under the guise of now a Sunni Shia thing. Here you have Iran, a country, one of the few countries in that part of the world that was invaded, faced a 7-year war by Iraq with the active support of the United States by Saddam before Saddam became the enemy. This country now wants to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, being opposed by two other entities. One other entity sitting with 200 nuclear weapons, another entity, the United States, being the only country in the world that actually has the blood of 185,000 people on its hand as a result of nuclear bombs being launched onto Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so a country that has never threatened anybody except in the rhetoric of, to some extent, of a mad, and whom our other two speakers regard also as inconsequential in Iranian politics, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. They are being problematized, and countries who've actually committed all these crimes, they're not up for discussion. That's not the debate.
Professor Steinberg is going to respond to that. But Professor Steinberg, I also would like to ask you this. Is Iran then, in Israeli public opinion, allowed to have or to enrich uranium for civilian purposes?
No question that if Iran was a normal country, if Iran wasn't threatening its neighbors, and if it wasn't promoting terrorism, then Iran would have the same rights as other countries do in terms of peaceful nuclear programs. It's when Iran cheated. It's when they violated the rules, when they lied to the International Atomic Energy Agency and the world. And they said, we're only going to enrich for peaceful purposes, but then they went far beyond that. There's absolutely no peaceful logic to enrich to 20%, to build these massive underground secret facilities for if they were actually doing a legal and completely harmless civilian.
Okay, because you're bringing in a technical element now. You say they've enriched to 20%, but is 20% naturally a level at which then you make a bomb?
20% is about halfway to making a bomb. If you wanted to enrich for a nuclear reactor, you'd enrich to perhaps 3 or 4%, maybe 5%. It's the 5 to 20% that set all the alarm bells off, that said, wait a minute, this is in fact a nuclear weapons program. It's also the fact that they have imported and done some testing of explosives that can only be explained as a testing for developing nuclear weapons. You don't need to use these very sophisticated explosives in secret facilities in order to make a peaceful nuclear reactor. So there are important technical issues in here, and we don't need to have a complete range of explanations which change every 5 minutes depending on the question and the answer to somehow try to justify the Iranian illegal nuclear program. The International Atomic Energy Agency and the United Nations Security Council and every other international body have all agreed Iran is cheating. It's violating its international obligations. And it's doing it not for peaceful purposes. It's doing it to promote what is a very, very dangerous international agenda.
All right. I'm going to bring in my other guest. But Professor Steinberg, again, I would like to go back to the issue of the approach employed or preferred by the Israelis, because then Israel is saying, let's go bomb. Some people are saying the problem with that is that Iran started developing its nuclear program and nuclear sites back in 1979, and therefore has so much skill. Unless you are prepared as Israel to go out there and really just kill all the scientists that Israel has, you will never actually be able to deal with this matter, because you can only postpone it for 2-3 years, and these scientists are there. These scientists are at universities. So what are you going to do? You've got to go and kill all the technical leadership in civilian research centers.
I think everybody who understands the details realizes that sanctions, international pressure, are much preferred to using military action. Military action is, by everybody's agreement, the least bad, the last resort, the last thing you do if you have no other choice. If Iran can be brought, the Iranian leadership and the Iranian public can be brought to their senses to realize that what they're doing is unacceptable for all the reasons that we've been talking about, then there will be no need for use of military action. But if there's no other choice, the one has to weigh the two options of doing nothing versus what might be a limited response or might, in fact, have a lot longer impact. Let's remember that you said that the Iranian nuclear program goes back to 1979. In fact, it goes back to some degree to the days of the Shah. It goes back 5, 6, 7 years before that.
All right. Sorry to interrupt you. I really need to...
One other quick point, and that is that it was dependent on imported technology. It was dependent on imported expertise, particularly from the former Soviet Union. It's not completely clear that they can replicate that. So while I do not advocate military action, I also think that saying that it would be useless is an exaggeration.
Well, that's a very important point, because Tom Wheeler, I would like you to respond to that particular point. Other people are saying, well, let's do and stick to issues of sanctions, diplomacy, and other intelligence-led operations as opposed to military strike. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's very accurate, for the point that I made earlier, that if you unleash military activity, bombing, and it goes backwards and forwards, you're going to decimate the whole of the Middle East. My favorite point is that if Iran has nothing to hide, if it wants to play according to the rules, it has a good example in the case of South Africa. South Africa had a nuclear weapon around 1991. De Klerk had the program.
Oh, terrible line here. We'll come back to you, Tom, on that in a minute. But also I'm going to ask Professor Isaac to respond, particularly to those issues. What does he think then about sanctions, diplomacy, and other measures in order to deal with this particular impasse? And also I'll go back to the lines then. But
The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
some emails. There's one from Adi who says, how long will the world protect spoilt brat Israel, even when it behaves like a gangster, threatening everyone else with nuke? Israel can build 350 nuke and threaten Iran, but Iran cannot even do any research or anything. Who empowered Israelis to talk about Shia and Sunni? How evil of them to play those cards along with the Saudis. Another email says, considering that Israel is not even recognized by most Muslim countries surrounding it, they have already wiped it off the map diplomatically. Israel itself treats UN resolutions with contempt, illegally annexing the West Bank and Jerusalem. Let Iran develop the bomb and keep Israel in check. The UN has failed. That email comes from Mpumelelo. Another one comes from Mohammed. It says, why is the United Nations not opposed to all nations that have nuclear weapons? Why is the United States and certain countries given special treatment? Let me go to Philip Msinga. Hello, Philip. Thank you for holding for me.
Yes, Xolani.
Go ahead, please.
Going to give me time. Xolani, firstly, you must remember that I want to remind this gentleman, Professor Steinberg, that their lies have come to be realized by the whole world. One, George W. Bush declared Iraq, Iran, and many other countries as evils of axis that needs to be eliminated and annihilated, those nations. Then we saw that they went into Iraq destroyed the peaceful community there, and just brought the whole society of Iraq into mess. Look what Pakistan is today because of their collaboration with the United States. You must also recall that during the war in Angola, it was same United States that passed on biological warheads straight to racist Israelis. And the racist Israelis brought them to South Africa to reinforce the apartheid army regime, to wipe off our boys who were fighting in Angola. Today, we are being told that the same country, Israel, which possesses dangerous nuclear weapons, that other nations who are particularly not classified as white cannot accelerate their knowledge in the scientific field, hence must be exterminated. I think time has come for particularly us in Africa and other members of the world community who are progressive to say, let us allow these cowboys to go and ignite war in Iran, and we must join hands with Iran and embark on the third world war to bring civilization to ourselves. Because if we only complain to these people must also pay with their blood in order to understand that
Philip,
we don't want this type of domination.
That's Philip Emsinger. Thank you very much. Professor, I wanted to talk to you, Professor Isak, a little bit earlier on about your thoughts on the sanctions, on diplomacy, and other intelligence-led initiatives.
Firstly, I think that all attempts must always be undertaken to avert war. I think the deep tragedy when we fall into this trap about singling out one country as the demon. We see this now happening in the case of Iran, the demonization of Iran and all this focus on Iran. It loses sight of the fact that there are ordinary human beings there. Mothers and fathers, children, parents, people just struggling to survive. All of those people become completely nameless. They become non-human for us in all of this war talk. And so this whole idea of just attack and prepare for war and so on, this is absolutely horrific. It goes against the grain of what it means to be human. And so all attempts must always be made to avert war. If this is the case, then yes. If sanctions is a means of averting war, yes. It must, however, also be pointed out that for many of us, Iran is not the heart of the problem. And I'm glad that Professor Steinberg agrees at least on the question of sanctions. I mean, I, for example, am a firm believer in the question of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, because I do think that so much of the instability in the Middle East comes from the Israeli regime and the policies that it follows towards the indigenous Palestinian people. But at the end of the day, it isn't a question about Israel must be wiped off the map and Iran is going to be doing it. I think all forms of nuclear weapons are wrong. The thousands that the United States possesses, the hundreds that Israel possesses, and also the one that Iran may possibly be attempting to possess. I think all of that is wrong.
Professor Steinberg, let me bring you back in. Because we're wrapping up here now, but I would like us to look in the long term. What should we be striving for in that region?
In the long term, we need to stop the kind of irrational hatred that we just heard from Professor Isak, to understand that the Jewish people have a historic right. We've been in this land for 4,000 years. We have the same right in our land as South African peoples have in their land. What he's advocating is a form of apartheid. I can't believe that someone from South Africa is advocating that kind of racial hatred against the Jewish people in their national home. Calling for a non-racial state where Arabs and Jews and Christians,
secular believers and non-believers, all of them will live together in a single land where God has not handed down this.
All right.
You're calling this
racism? Professor Steinberg?
Back to me.
So say what again, Professor Steinberg? You were saying something?
That when Iranian representatives in any forum, and I've been in these kinds of meetings, where Iranian representatives refuse to shake hands or to acknowledge the humanity of their Israeli counterparts and their colleagues, that's racism. So I would hope that people in South Africa who have experienced racism will understand that it's Israel that's the victim of racism.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing, and I would like you to respond to this particular one.
On Iran, we have to confront here what is the reality, which is a violation of international law.
But Professor Steinberg, when you say Professor Isaac, for instance, is using hatred and so on, are you referring to him questioning Israeli policies? Is that racism?
Well, we just heard from him. In his support of what he calls boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, these campaigns to wipe Israel off the map are fundamentally racist. They refuse to acknowledge the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. The main problem in the Middle East is that everybody hates everybody else. There is more hatred in this region than any place else in the world. Sunni and Shia. We've had between rich and poor. We see it. We see it in Egypt. We see it in Syria. We see it in Gaddafi. We see dictatorships. We see the hatred of women, the discrimination against women in Saudi Arabia. Those are the real problems. And what all of these regimes and dictators and their supporters have done is created an image of Israel to divert attention. Let's stop attacking Israel. Israel is not the problem here.
When we in South Africa, in the African National Congress and in the Pan-Africanist Congress called upon the world to divest from South Africa, we did not do so because of our hatred for white people in South Africa or for our desire to see the death of South Africa. We were driven by a desperation to see a non-racial society where, let me finish. I'm not going to be shut up again in our country we've been shut up for many, many years by white people. I'm not going to be shut up by a white person again. And so our call was a call for a non-racial democracy where every human being, regardless of his race, regardless of his color, regardless of his religion, where every person would have a place under the sun, and where we're not going to live into a country that God had set aside for a particular ethnic group. We weren't going to reduce this country to a piece of real estate. All of South Africa for all of God's people. This was a vision that was good enough for our country.
All right,
no reason why it shouldn't be good enough for Israel.
Comment a little, because I'm wrapping up now. Tom Wheeler, maybe you'll give me your thoughts on this. I hope you will come.
Well, I think we've unfortunately, in spite of what the professor says, descended into a racist argument here, and I much regret it, because I think that the debate has become totally irrational, and I don't think I can really contribute anything to it.
You know, Professor Steinberg, I just would like to get something out of you as we wrap up, because does the view of a military intervention reflect what the Israelis on the ground are saying?
Absolutely not. Israel does not want, in any form, any kind of military threat. The question is, what are the alternatives to do that? We are threatened by Hezbollah rockets. Tens of thousands of rockets are based in southern Lebanon aimed at Israelis. Those are all Iranian rockets. There are rockets flying from Gaza attacking Israeli citizens, civilians, today. Look at your newspapers. Look at your television. Many of those are manufactured in Iran. Israel does not want to have a military confrontation and doesn't want to be the target of these kinds of attacks.
All right, gentlemen, I really have got to end it here.
The international community to say to Iran, blow the whistle, stop doing these illegal acts, and then there will not be a military
all right, to all of you, I really have got to end it right here. Professor Farid Isaac with me here in the studio from the Center for the Study of Democracy at UJ, as well as Professor Gerald Steinberg, President of the NGO Monitor, live on the line from Jerusalem, and Tom Wheeler of the South African Institute of International Affairs. We've got to end it here. It's an emotional discussion, clearly, but I hope that you were able to pick out at least some facts or some issues that you would want to take away from this particular discussion, from this particular discussion. From this particular discussion, from this particular discussion, from this particular discussion, from this particular